last week, we rejoin the crowd once more as they gather on the lake shore to hear Jesus. Can you imagine the scene as it unfolds? You might notice the gentle sounds of the water moving in and out, the quiet ripples of the lake so gently crashing into the sides of the boat where the wise one sits to teach. I can hear a bit of a charged rustling in the crowd. It sounds like sighs of relief and comfort mixed with some unsettledness. The kind of thing any of us may feel when we know something good is happening, but we can't quite explain how or what. Some are whispering amongst themselves, "What is God's kingdom like?" And I can imagine someone else saying, "These stories that Jesus is telling, they sound so simple. Then why does it seem like they hide as much as they show?" I imagine the crowd is unsettled, but not anxious, not worried. It's intrigue and longing and desire that unsettles them. I can feel and hear the refreshing, cool breeze coming off of the waters, and yet that pales in comparison to the comfort of the story that Jesus has just told. You might remember it from last week. It's the one about the seeds that land in the right soil. They produce an extravagant harvest of 30-fold, 60-fold, or completely unheard of, 100-fold harvest. Abundance, abundance, abundance. If it happens as I see it, Jesus tells that story, and then he pauses for a moment, letting it settle in for just a bit. And at just the right moment, he began to speak once more. And as he did, I can only imagine the crowd leaning in, remembering how important he said it is for them to listen and to understand the stories he is saying to them. The kingdom of heaven is like, he begins, and this story that he's about to tell rings with the familiarity of the story he has just told, the one about the sower and the soil and that abundant harvest. Jesus is talking farming again. And yet we know something much bigger than this is in his mind as well. In this parable, the big questions he's addressing in the last one about why do some move away from this movement if this is such good news, those questions expand. If God is so good and so powerful, then why do the weeds of evil grow so freely in the midst of God's field? In the story, it isn't for lack of trying on the part of the sower to sow good seeds. In fact, good seed has been sown, and like in the last story, it's landed in the fertile soil, and the good wheat is growing as it ought. But as the growing season continues, as those slaves continue to pay attention to the field where they grow, the ears begin to form at the top of the plant. And the ones who watch the field notice that not all of the seeds that have grown are the same. Some are wheat, essential for making bread, a staple food item in that day. But among the wheat are weeds as well. Now, the slaves who work in the field are confused by what is growing in front of them. They don't know how to reconcile the fact that there are weeds in the midst of this good field. But it's the one who owns the field who understands the reason they're there. Someone who intended harm, the owner explains, has come under the cover of night and sown the weeds among the good seed in the field. Now, with the mindset of productivity and problem solving in mind, I can really appreciate these slaves and their desire to get the weeds out as quickly as possible. Should we remove them, we can do it today. But the owner is patient. The owner recognizes the bigger picture in front of him. So the owner says, just wait, just hold on. For this one knows that removing the weeds would also do harm to the wheat. Later, there will be an opportunity to distinguish and separate the two more easily, but that time is not yet. As with all of Jesus' stories, this one's not really about agriculture, but rather a story in the common language of the common people, addressing the big questions of evil and suffering in this world. As Jesus only would later disclose to his closest followers, this is a story about the question, why does evil exist in God's good world if God is as powerful as we claim God to be? That's a good question. Why are the children of evil so effective in God's world? That's a good question, too. Now, those are the big questions. But before we get there, isn't it interesting how easy it is in this story to distinguish these are the good ones, those are the bad? For our time, it's probably good for us to focus in on a different part of this story than when judgment will come and who gets to mete it out. I think we would do well to focus in on the weeds and the wheat before they grew the head at the top. You see, as the two grow, they look identical. There's no clear way to tell a weed from the tare apart until they start to form at the top. For most of the growing season, you'd have no idea. They're indistinguishable. I think there's some wisdom for us right there. We live in a time where there are powerful, polarizing forces at play trying to tear us apart at any point that they can. They come from many places. As I reflect on my own thinking, they aren't all out there. I amaze myself at how easy it is to make a snap judgment about someone. Anyone with me? Each new day, it seems, we're given a new litmus test to determine who is in and who ought to be kicked out. Is this person too woke? Not woke enough? Did the person vote for so-and-so or not? Is that person kind to so-and-so or not? Are they of the right socioeconomic status? Do they fit our standards of normativity? It's too easy to make these quick judgments. You're a child of God, which seems to usually mean you're kind of like me, or close enough to like me. Or you're a child of the devil, which means I probably just don't like you. The truth is certainly much more complicated than that. We're all in process. Like the weeds and the wheat growing up in the field, none of us are fully formed yet. Weeds and wheat are not so easily distinguishable in most cases. So it is with us. Each of us is more complicated, more interesting. And it's good for us to suspend judgment when we think about one another. With that being said, though, I want to be entirely clear. This is not to say that every harmful idea that anyone might have needs a hearing in our midst. And a person who inflicts harm should not have the freedom to do so. Not suggesting we don't need boundaries to keep one another safe. We all deserve protection in the presence of an abuser. Let me be clear about that. Apart from those situations, though, our parable tells us that in God's kingdom there is benefit, or at least harm reduction, from allowing the weeds to grow alongside the wheat in the field of this world. While the slaves wanted a quick solution, the owner was patient, knowing that each plant that produces a harvest is worth protecting. This is essentially a story about God's patience. I hope we can hear this and take this to heart today. God is patient enough with the big plans of dealing with the troubles of this world that God has the time to wait, so each of us can grow and mature in safety, so as not to be uprooted in the process. And while this is a story about God's patience, it's not one of God's passivity. While the weeds may be allowed to grow alongside the wheat for the time being, evil will not ultimately win out. Now, honestly, I would have liked to have read that gospel lesson without that last 3 or 4 verses about judgment in there. I don't get that part. I struggle with that. And that's kind of the point. I don't get it, but God does. And somehow in God's wisdom and in God's love, God has a plan to tend to the evil of this world. Thanks be to God. That's actually good news, whether it makes sense in my little brain or not. In the midst of this complicated world where God is still working, this world where wheat is not easily distinguished from weeds, we are free from being the judges. Amen? And therefore, we are free to love one another. Now, this is an interesting room in which to hear the story of the wheat and the tares. If we look around at all of these windows, I can see a lot more of them, but you can see our loge windows with the pretty new lights in them. Take a look at those windows. And for those who are watching online, Keith, you already got it. Thank you. For those who are online, you can see those windows as well. Now, it almost feels to me like the design of these windows was intended to remind us of this very story. All the wheat is gathered into God's barn, a place where the harvest has been stored. Now, I don't know if it's entirely true or not, but I've heard that there's some speculation that all of the wheat on all these windows throughout our building, that they hang upside down, because that's what you do after you harvest wheat. You hang it upside down to dry. I've also heard that maybe all the windows were put in upside down, but I like I like the first interpretation of things a little better. In any place, when we gather in this space, when we gather as this people, it can be a sign for us of God's ultimate redemption. When all things are made right and the harvest has been brought in to God's barn. Reminders like that are important if we're going to have patience, if we're going to trust God. Because the fact of the matter is, as much as this may feel like a place of being gathered together in God's barn, there's still wheat and weeds growing together in the midst of this field. And it's helpful for us to remember today to slow down our judgments, because it's not always easy to tell which is which. May it be so. Amen.